you need a supermajority to vote against it. And that makes it all the more difficult for opponents of the agreement. So this is part of what's happening right now in the Congress. As you may know, Robert Menendez, one of New Jersey's senators, has come out vocally against this agreement. The other senator, Cory Booker, we're not entirely certain. We suspect that he's going to be in favor of the agreement, but he hasn't clarified firmly what his position will be. Robert Menendez, of course, as you know, is currently under indictment, and so he's not sitting well with the administration anyway. But nevertheless, his opposition to this agreement is well known long before the indictment was even bandied about as a possibility against him. So the most notable proponent of the agreement in the Senate has been Senator Harry Reid, and he came out recently in favor of the agreement. So just to recap some of the weak points of this from the critics' perspective, within the first 10 years we have this 24-day delay on inspections. That allows a lot of time for things to change. Even though radioactive isotopes remain in soil for more than 24 days, as you know, the samples can be collected by the Iranians themselves, and so that creates a question about whether or not we even are testing something that is at the site we want it to be at. You may have heard the phrase snapback. Snapback is a term that's meant to describe any sanctions that can be reimposed on Iran if they cheat or if they're found to cheat. The problem with snapback sounds like it's something that's going to happen like that, like snap. It's going to, turn on a dime and reimpose sanctions. The problem with that is, in order for sanctions to be reimposed, there will have to be a vote of a committee, and that committee includes China, Russia, and believe it or not, Iran itself. And so those three members, of course, will likely vote against it. Iran definitely, Russia and China probably, because they have a lot of business interests in Iran. And Iran is seen by these countries, China and Russia, as being a thorn not in the side of China and Russia, but rather a thorn in the side of the U.S. This has been part of the reason for Russia's disposition towards Syria, for example. And so the notion that the sanctions can quickly be reimposed should Iran violate the terms of the agreement is unlikely. And this has been a source of concern for those who have been against the agreement. So the other question, of course, is the so-called anytime, anywhere idea about inspections. As I noted, the 24-day delay will prevent that, and this has been considered a weak point ever since the beginning. Also, there's no unilateral U.S. inspections. The U.S. doesn't get to do this. This is all based in Vienna, Austria. And so there's no ability for the United States to participate in this or make decisions about it, even though the U.S. has been the lead negotiator in terms of trying to strike this deal. And as I noted earlier, after 10 years and then after 15 years completely, Iran gets to become a nuclear threshold state if it wants to. And whether it wants to or not will be a question of whether or not the regime retains the same character in 10 to 15 years that it does today. And as someone mentioned earlier, 10 to 15 years can go by pretty quickly. So the disposition of Iran at this point is unclear. We know that their negotiators are in favor of this deal. This would be the foreign ministry as well as the current prime minister. However, the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, has come out with statements that suggest that there's maybe certain provisions that won't be abided by from the beginning. And so this is a concern for the U.S. and the other members of the Security Council as well. There are certain issues that have not been covered by this agreement, and I want to note what those are. One would be prisoners. There are a few U.S. or there are a few citizens that hold dual citizenry, both in Iran and the U.S. Probably the one you've heard about is Jason Razian, who is a reporter for the Washington Post. He has been held since the summer of 2014, and he has been charged and is currently on trial for espionage. The basis for this claim is that he wrote a letter on behalf of a family member to the Obama administration, I think basically soliciting a job, and Iran has pointed to that as evidence that he works for the CIA. He's been held incommunicado. His family members have periodically traveled to Iran trying to gain access to this private, non-public trial. The trial is apparently over, and we are awaiting the judgment of the court. We don't know what will happen. His status apparently was not part of the negotiations. In other words, it was kind of an off-limits area. The U.S. did not want to press the Iranian regime on this point. There are several other prisoners that the U.S. considers political prisoners. It's interesting to note, just this past week, that Iran has publicly said it is seeking release of 19 Iranians who it claims are political prisoners in the U.S. And some of those are people that were charged with domestic crimes in the U.S. Others are people who were charged with crimes related to the Iranian regime itself. For example, there was an attempted assassination conspiracy in a Washington, D.C. restaurant for the ambassador from Saudi Arabia, and that was foiled by the FBI, and the chief plotter is held currently in a U.S. jail, federal prison, that is, federal jail. And so these are the people that the Iranian regime wants to free from the U.S. Another area that was completely off limits in the deliberations was Iran's terror support activities abroad. That is Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, all of these groups and their activities, and whether or not Iran would stop funding them was not part of the discussion. And so none of those issues, even though a lot of people in the U.S. wanted them to be included, they were not formally included. So what are the consequences? What are the likely consequences of this deal? A lot of people are predicting that this deal will result in a nuclearization of the Middle East. In other words, presuming the Iranian regime still wants to obtain a nuclear weapon after 10 to 15 years, that creates an incentive for other countries in the region to seek their own nuclear weapons program. Israel, of course, is well known, even though it's never officially admitted it, it's well known to have its own nuclear arsenal. However, it is feared that both Pakistan and Saudi Arabia will seek to obtain their own arsenals. It is well known that for years the Syrian regime wanted to obtain one. As you know, some of its reactors were bombed by the Israelis several years ago, and even though that regime is on its last legs now, it appears we don't know what the future of that area is, and so that may also be a future potential nuclear state. So the concern is that this agreement will effectively create incentives for countries in the region to seek nuclear weapons in order to deter an expansionist Iran. Also, this deal is temporary by its nature, and we don't know what Iran's going to be like in 15 years, but while this deal is ongoing, they get to keep their nuclear infrastructure and they get to later import missiles. And so some of the things that Iran has been seeking in the past will be coming to it in the future, assuming they abide by this deal. The sanctions relief itself is predicted to have a more dangerous Middle East. In other words, once Iran gets more money, that I mentioned earlier, that 100 billion plus, much of it will be used domestically to help the Iranian economy, but that means more oil can be sold from Iran's stocks, and they also have the ability to fund Hezbollah and Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other potential groups. So, what about Israel? What will Israel do in response to this? We don't know. Obviously, Prime Minister Netanyahu has said this is a historic mistake. It's possible that Israel could take military action. In an interview for his forthcoming book, former Prime Minister and Defense Minister Ehud Barak claims that he and Prime Minister Netanyahu prepared strike plans against Iran's nuclear facilities 3 different times between 2010 and 2013, but they did not carry them out only because a couple of other ministers, a finance minister and a strategic affairs minister, objected because they were uncertain what the consequences would be. So this new book that's coming out suggests that Israel wasn't merely contemplating or planning in the abstract to take military action against the nuclear program in Iran, but was really on the verge of taking action. And so it's uncertain, but probably likely that these plans could be carried into effect in the future. I guess I should backtrack on probably likely. I'll say that they're going to be much more seriously considered in the future. What are the consequences in the U.S.? Well, interesting to note that during the period of the imposition of these sanctions, some state governments in the U.S. Have created their own sanctions laws, which they think can be carried into effect now because this is not a treaty. American states would have to abide by a treaty, and if sanctions were lifted, any states would have to lift them as well, because states can't conduct their own foreign policy in the U.S. But the argument that some states have made is that now that this is only an executive agreement, not a treaty, means there's no constitutional prohibition on these states creating their own sanctions laws. So, for example, recently the state of Michigan proposed to maintain a sanctions law so that companies that do business with Iran won't get state of Michigan contracts, and that state companies cannot do things like invest pension funds. State pension funds and other funds cannot invest in companies that do business with Iran. So this creates some disincentives at the state level for American corporations that would otherwise want to do business with Iran. It depends on the state, of course, and the willingness of those companies to buck the state law and suffer the consequences in that state. What's the public opinion about this? Well, there's a recent CNN ORC poll that found that 52% of those surveyed want the deal to be rejected, whereas 44% want it to be approved. The remaining number is uncertain. So that's a small majority against approval, if that's representative, and it's a scientific sample, so it seems to be. Of Republicans who are asked, 66%, which is no surprise. In fact, I'm surprised it's not higher. 66% of Republicans don't want the deal approved. 55% of independents don't want the deal approved. However, 61% of Democrats do want the deal approved. It is very difficult for polling groups to survey Jewish citizens. It's because of where Jews live in different areas of the country. They're in pockets, but also sometimes spread out. And it's difficult to actually obtain a scientific sample to see what quote-unquote Jewish public opinion is. And so that evidence is so scant that it can't really be described accurately. So we don't know, except anecdotally, what Jewish members of the community want done with this deal. Some of the missteps. As I mentioned, this was not submitted as a treaty by President Obama. Also, it was seen by many members of Congress as a slap in the face to Congress that President Obama submitted the deal very quickly to the United Nations for its approval prior to it being debated and then approved or disapproved in the U.S. Congress. That was seen as a bad move politically, and it gained no friends of the administration in terms of people that might be on the fence. However, of course, as I mentioned earlier, Congress itself may have misstepped when it already tied its hands by allowing the agreement to go into effect unless it disapproves it rather than requiring it or demanding that it be submitted as a treaty. So I've got the time at 11:47 right now, and I think that leaves a fair amount of time to have any questions, and also I'd like to get some of your views about what you think of this deal and a sense of your opinions on what you think is good or bad about it.
How come Russia wasn't mentioned?
I'm sorry, you have to say that one more time. I couldn't hear you.
How come Russia is a big country? They won't mention anything.
Do you mean Russia's involvement in the negotiations?
Yes.
Right. Well,
They as dangerous as them.
there's one aspect of Russia that I did not mention. They recently, within the last month, agreed to sell surface-to-air missiles to Iran, which is a system that would be a much more advanced technological system that could strike Israeli or any other types of jets that would come into Iranian airspace. Much more effective than their current system, so it's a very technologically sophisticated system that Russia has agreed to sell. So, as you indicate with your question, Russia has laid low during the negotiations publicly, but they certainly will benefit from the sale of this missile system, and Iran, of course, gains greater security by purchasing this system. Yes, sir.
What is the feeling about the other nations involved, China, Germany, and so forth? Are they for or against?
As far as we know, every other member of the negotiating group is definitely in favor of this deal. Many European countries have companies that want to do business with Iran, and the only reason they haven't been, some of them have done it surreptitiously and covertly, they've been fined for it, but the only reason some companies have not done so is because of the United Nations sanctions that are being lifted. And so those countries are definitely in favor of this agreement. And in fact, no country that I know of is actually against it. There have been a few dissenting voices within the governments of those countries, but there's no indication that any of these countries is going to be against this at all. They support it partly for financial reasons, but also they are hopeful that this will be an agreement that they think will work. And they're rather optimistic that the Iranian regime will change its character, or hopefully will change over the next 10 to 15 years.
So overall, what is the United States getting out of this, this whole agreement? Is it just that we won't be in war for the next 15 years if they, don't go back on this?
Well, that's the description of what we can hope for from supporters of the agreement, is that if this agreement is honored, let's assume it's honored.
Right.
If it is honored, we get this window of time during which any weaponization of nuclear material and technology will take up to a year to implement. This supposedly pushes Iran back by several months in their ability to weaponize or to make their program a military program rather than a civilian program. Now that's if it's honored.
Right.
If it's not honored, the question is, as I described earlier in terms of inspections, how are we going to know? And what kind of action can be taken? Will sanctions be quickly reimposed? One of the concerns about this is not only will it not happen quickly, but also there'll be a lot of resistance, because not only will Russia and China not support it, but also the other European countries like Britain, France, and especially Germany, which have a lot of financial stake in the changes in Iran. They're unlikely to be enthusiastic in supporting sanctions again, which will deny the ability for their companies, their domestic companies, to maintain these connections.
And I mean, from what you say, it's rather scary. I mean, they have 24 hours notice, 24-day notice, and the fact that the three countries are going to be the ones that are going to be checking the soil, you know, and you said the Iran people are the ones that are gonna be picking the soil samples?
That's right.
I mean, really, like, we're really gonna be blindfolded as to if they're really honorable about this.
Well, and that's one of the concerns is,
Yeah,
if you don't trust your negotiating partner, which we don't, and the reason for that, by the way, is because they violated
yeah,
sanctions regimes in the past, and agreements. And so the concern is there's no incentive not to do so again.
right.
But the verification, the famous Reagan phrase, trust but verify, which means you don't really trust them. You want to verify, and that will create trust. And the concern is that verification part is hindered, if not absent, because of what you just mentioned about them procuring their own samples.
And also too, like in the news, we've been seeing how, which is, Iran, like, have been on the news recently yelling death to America, and they hate Americans.
Right, that's a common phrase.
Yeah.
The reporters who don't speak Farsi, they all know that phrase in Farsi. And I heard a report this past week where they went to a rally and they still chant it, because they chant it at every rally, death to America and death to Israel.
Yeah.
And so that's not changed. There's no indication that it will.
Right.
And there's really no incentive to make it change.
Right, so the Iranian people obviously are not overjoyed that this is going to happen, or even if they are, they sound like they're not.
Well, that's a good question. It's tough to know what the Iranian people think.
Right.
Very tough. This is a theocratic regime that is very invasive. They have a huge intelligence service that's domestic intelligence spy service. It's really tough to get an accurate read on what Iranians think of domestic policy.
Why is Germany included in anything?
I'm sorry, repeat that one more time, please.
What's your question,
I
Geddes? Say
said,
it loud.
why is Germany included in anything? They should be outside.
Well, that's a good question.
On their own, they didn't have their neighbors.
So that's a good question as well. What is the role of Germany? Why are they included? The reason that Germany is included with the so-called P5+1, that +1 is Germany, the reason they were included is because they have such a huge economy. They are the generating engine in terms of innovation and even much of the labor in modern Europe. Certainly, they have a great deal of wealth. They're the wealthiest country in Europe, and that's the reason for their involvement, is because the fear was, in other words, you could not get an agreement if you did not include that huge economy as part of your negotiating team. And so that's why Germany was included. So just an informal...
Not Jewish money, what Germany has.
From World War II.
Absolutely.
Yes. And that's been a concern about what kinds of assets certain companies that existed during the war profited from Jewish labor and confiscated money in addition to the Nazi government. That's true. Just out of curiosity, and you don't have to vote, but I was just curious, raise your hand if you're in favor of the deal.
Still don't understand.
He said, raise your hand if you're in
I
favor.
understand what he said, but I don't understand the deal.
Okay. Raise your hand if you're definitely against the deal. Raise your hand if you're not sure. Okay, all right. Well, that's just interesting to me because it's really, this is an issue that divides people because we're just not sure what the outcome of this deal is going to be. And we don't know. There's no clear prediction about how things are really going to turn out, both internationally and domestically in Iran.
I wasn't sure, because a couple of times I had to leave the room. Did you mention anything about money being given to Iran? Is the the United States giving money to Iran?
We are releasing funds that have been frozen in American accounts that were owned by the Iranian government
Okay,
since the
so we're just
1970s.
releasing them. We're not actually giving them any of our own money.
Well, there may be discretionary funds that in some fashion will be allocated towards implementing this agreement. To date, I have not heard of or read about any new money, so to speak,
Right.
that is being given to Iran. There has been a dispute there have been several lawsuits against Iran or Iranian-owned assets, wherein a judgment was made in favor of the plaintiffs in the suit. These are U.S. plaintiffs who sought recovery for terrorist activities sponsored by the Iranian government. Those funds were never allocated to satisfy those judgments. In other words, the monies that have been held frozen, those plaintiffs asked and demanded for that money to be released to them in order to satisfy the judgments of these U.S. courts that found that Iran was responsible for the deaths of their family members.
Right.
That money will not be released to these families to satisfy those judgments. It will go back to Iran. And that's been a source of contention for some of these families.
Yeah. Wow.
To go to the fair.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned earlier that there's an 8-month or 8-year.
There's an 8-year delay before ballistic missile technology is lifted. There is still a sanction on ballistic missile technology going to Iran for the next 8 years. But as I mentioned earlier, the Iranian government or members of the government have said they're not going to abide by that anyway. So we don't know how that's going to carry out.
What's your opinion?
Uh-oh. I knew someone was going to maybe ask me that. I'm somewhat skeptical. I'm skeptical that this agreement will achieve what is claimed of it. I think the best skeptical assessment of this was actually, if you can read it, you can read it online if you get a chance, is Senator Chuck Schumer's description of why he would love to get a good deal with Iran, but that he thinks that this will not produce what all of its proponents think it's going to produce. So I'm a bit skeptical that it will, and I think his is a well-reasoned argument for why it's probably, we could go back and try to get a better deal, which, by the way, is what Senator Schumer wants to do. He doesn't think it's an option of disagreement or war. He thinks it's there's another option, which is go back to the negotiating table, the U.S., even if it's only alone, without those other members in Europe, go back to the negotiating table and press Iran. And there is precedent for this. The Congress has in the past demanded that a president go back and renegotiate a treaty, and they've done it. And they actually get what they wanted. They got something different than they had originally agreed to. So there is an ability to do this. And I think that it's possible to do it here, but I don't think that's going to happen. So, but I also am not sure what's going to happen in the Congress either. I don't know if they're going to.
So we're voting on this in September?
In September, when Congress is currently in recess,
Right.
and when they come back in September, there will be a vote. There will be several votes, but the idea is that at some point they're going to have to vote in both houses whether or not to disapprove this. Not approve it, but disapprove it. And that is, it sounds like a technical point, but it's easier to defeat the move to disapprove it, meaning the agreement will go into effect if only a minority in Congress oppose that, meaning they support the agreement.
We need a large majority to disapprove.
You need a supermajority. Yeah, a veto-proof supermajority,
Yeah.
which means 67 senators and was it 238 House members? I'm fuzzy on that number. I have to look it up. But so that you need a supermajority basically to oppose this deal, and that may be hard. It may be hard because it depends on how many Democrats who are currently sitting on the fence, or at least have not declared their position, what they seek to do.
So we're going to have a House vote, and if the House votes for then they would
Janet,
have a veto.
Janet,
There'll be a House and a Senate vote. Each house will vote separately.
And then the veto.
Well, if they vote against it, then